Shabbat Shalom, fam. Welcome everybody to another lesson. This is Francisco Perez. I hope you guys enjoying your Shabbat. Alright, let's get cracking. First off, let me just get this out.
Well, these people were real characters. 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 So Moses.
Daddy,
You're 42% British.
This actually happened when I was quite young. I wrote the first chapter when I was 14 to my first book. And so I started investigating that, and yes, I think he is right. That strange idea about Judean history. First part that really set me onto this was the history written by Josephus Flavius, who was the first century Judean. Flavius, who was the first century Judean historian, who had a very strange idea about Judean history, which wasn't obviously taught to myself. And he said that the Israelites were actually the Hyksos Egyptians. So he was basically saying that the Israelite leaders were pharaohs of Egypt, which is a bit of a...
You hear that? The Hyksos, he's gonna say, are the Israelites. And like I was saying, those images is whitewashed. That's not the way they look. They look more like me and like you. Now, we're gonna go into this, and it's gonna be a lot of crap. I'm gonna try and make it the 20 minute mark. And let's see what we can get out of this, alright?
An odd thing, really, for a Jewish historian to actually say. And so I started investigating that, and yes, I think he is right. And that forms the whole of the basis of the 10 books I've written on this subject.
It's really incredible, and I think it's really important to be able to go back and look again at history, because if we can't...
We're gonna see it in a different light. And from my last video, you've seen that the reason why Joseph was given power was because he devised a way for the people of that area to survive famine and for them to get rich off of the famine. So they said, bro, you passed, man. You got the job, right? And then he said, man, there's thousands more of me. I mean, there's the Israelites. There's thousands more of me, just like me, innovative. We got all this technology from Sumer, our homeland. Why don't you bring my people in here, and you can have the technology we know. We'll show you everything. Just to help my people survive. Alright, yeah, sure.
Navigate our present time or understand really where we are now, it could greatly be due to the fact that we've been greatly misinformed about our history by a variety of different sources. So work such as yours, Ralph, is very important so that we can take another look at it. Was that originally what inspired you as well? Was, you know, just sort of seeing the division, the arguing, all and going into all these different fields of thought about the Bible and all these ancient scriptures. Was that sort of your motivation to try to bring in a more clear picture for yourself?
Yes, yes, very much so. I'm not religious, so but I have a deep sorry, a bit of a mental blank there. I'm not religious, but I've had a deep interest in religious history, and it always struck me as odd that people will believe religious history without actually knowing the true foundations of where it came from. So there was a big disconnect here between reality and what people were believing in their faith. And I just felt for a long, long time that if someone's going to believe something, they've got to have that belief.
So he's going to give you a greater sense of your ancestors. At the same time, he's going to pervert the whole history of your people, our people, and say that the Israelites are actually just Egyptians. And the Bible is true, but it's actually an Egyptian piece of work. You see what kind of piece of work these people are? Because as we learn history, we know that Kemet is the youngest of those civilizations, and that the Egyptian writings and Egyptian doctrine is the youngest, and they come from older doctrines, and many of the principles come from specific ancient doctrines that aim to pervert you and to make for you to worship many gods. He's trying to say that the Israelites always worship many gods, and monotheism was a later invention, which I proved to you through all the ancient civilizations in my other video, that we came from monotheism and then we became polytheistic.
Grounded in reality. And the only way you can do that is to find the real history that underlies it. So if the real history is actually very different to what people are actually believing in, then I'm sort of duty-bound to actually give them the real history. They need the real history to understand the foundations of their faith. And if the real history of Judaism is that it was Egyptian, that changes the story a great deal. And I think Josephus was correct. So we started this with the book Jesus Last of the Pharaohs, and that sought to understand what Josephus was saying and compare the history of the Hyksos, they were the shepherd kings, with the history that is present in the Torah. And of course the patriarchs in the Torah were called shepherds. So why were they called shepherds? We have this history within biblical education that every one of these people has to be a poor shepherd, a real shepherd looking after real sheep. But of course it would...
Now you're going to see the level of deception, because here we are thinking we just fucking nobodies, a family group of people who are just struggling to survive, a small batch of people, and we're just a little humble little town, a little humble little village of people. If you could please help me, sir. Sir, could you please help me with the dollar? Could you please feed me, sir? No, that's not the way it was. We was a strong people, kingdom. Abraham had thousands of soldiers. He had a standing army. We were shepherd kings, not shepherd, poor little shepherds. We were kings with armies, and we asked another nation to take refuge within their lands at a time of disparity. And because we were so great and so renowned, and we had this technology, the war chariots, we invented a new laminated bowl, we had all this knowledge from Sumer. They said, man, we need these people. They gonna make Kemet. And what do we know about us today? Oh, they ain't shit. They ain't shit. Oh, they're fake. Yeah, we are the salt of the earth today. We make all their movies good. We make all their shows good. We make all their music good. They love all our music. They love the way we dance. They love the way we talk. They love the way we love. Everything about us they love. They try to be just like us because they just want to have a little bit of that light that just shines out from inside of you, from your brown adipose. Just line you up from the inside. Saying, I am in the image of the Creator. I'm great. And they saying, I want to be just like that. And today, what? You ain't shit. You have no history. And you came from slaves or beggars.
It was not that at all. These people were the Hyksos Shepherd Kings, and they were a well-known faction within northern Egypt, because Egypt was divided at the time, and they had their own monarchy, their own priesthood, and they were pharaohs of Egypt.
Their own monarchy, their own priesthood, they were pharaohs of Egypt.
Egypt.
Why do you think all that shit you gravitated to it? Because it's your history. You're like, this is so familiar to you. And why you was doing all those martial arts moves. He's doing all this stuff. Because you just like, there was a piece of you that was missing. And what you were seeing was calling out to you saying, doesn't this look familiar? Don't you remember this? Do you know your name?
And at one point they took over the whole of Egypt, which puts a rather different spin on the history of Judaism. Because as the Hyksos pharaohs, of course, they would have been fully polytheistic. They would have believed in all of the pantheon of rather different spin on...
Oh, rather different spin. You see how this fella's spinning us around. It's giving us a little spin. Yet when we read and learn about the history, when these shepherd kings came into power, they refused to worship the pantheonic gods, and they were only worshiping a singular God. Yes, just like today, we get perverted and we worship many gods. But when we have a foundation, we stick to the Creator. Okay? But he's going to pervert it.
The history of Judaism. Because as the Hyksos pharaohs, of course, they would have been fully polytheistic. They would have believed in all of...
You see, just because they had the title Pharaoh, he's saying they had to have been. But we know in Egypt, what we consider Egypt, that at many different times, the pharaohs took on monotheism.
Of the pantheon of Egyptian gods. So original Judaism is not the Judaism that we see today, by a long mark.
And he's right. The original Judaism is not the Judaism we see today, but he's going to make it seem that the real Judaism is many God worship, Canaanite rituals.
Today,
Canaanite ways.
And that's obvious if you just even read the Torah. I mean, if you read the history of the United Monarchy, you will find that they were always worshipping other gods. So monotheism didn't really enter. They tried to make it enter Judaism at that time, but it was not monotheistic at that time at all. King Solomon was raising temples to...
You see how they're always bringing up King Solomon. Oh, but King Solomon started off monotheistic, and because of his 900 foreign wives, who did not do what the Bible, what the Torah says, to disown their forefather and to practice the Torah, meaning the Creator only. But they love to bring him up.
3 or 4 of the local gods at that time, most of which were Egyptian type gods. Plus they had sacred groves. They were...
If the Egyptians take an original gods and they use the same formats and create gods that's the original, already people, they're already gods in existence, and Egypt creates that, and then other people worship those older gods. Now everybody's stealing Egyptian stuff, when Egyptians are just using those older gods. See how everything is being perverted, yet all the information is on the table. And see, no, you're never gonna get it, because even if you're logical and educated and can see things, your bias will prevent you from putting it together, because it's all fake.
They had phallic symbols they were venerating, and the Queen of Heaven, of course, who's one of the central aspects of the book of Jeremiah, was they were worshipping the Queen of Heaven. And
who was worshipping? He's not stating that in Hyksos or in specific times in Egypt we worship these things. He's stating that, in the Bible it states many times throughout the Bible that we worship these beings. See how he's taking all our bad stuff and then pushing them in your face, like your girl, like, oh, well, you did this when you was in high school to me, huh? So what am I supposed to think? In high school you did this. Like, girl, come on, it's high school. What the fuck? We 30 fucking years old now. You was in high school against me. Oh, remember what you did 2 years ago? That's why. Like, what the fuck? So he's using shit that's not even related, that happens later on in history, more recent history, to prove ancient Israelites ain't shit. They're actually Egyptians. So forget about Hebrew. Forget about the Asiatics.
Queen of Heaven was, of course, Isis. So we have Isis worship, and then that flows all the way through into the New Testament, of course, because Isis and
You see? The Egyptians got their bullshit from some bullshit in the past. And then we reinventing the fucking bullshit. And all we seem to talk about is the bullshit. And we use the bullshit to say our history is bullshit, when there's all the fucking babies in the bathwater saying, please take me out,
Horus became the Madonna and Child. It's the same imagery. In fact, if you go to the Pantheon in Rome today, there is still a statue of Isis and Horus there, but it's labeled as Mary and Jesus. And all they've done is they've recarved her headdress slightly to make her look like Mary and Jesus. But it's a statue of Isis and Horus, of course. So this is where, you know, the ancient religions comes more into the modern world, modern beliefs, Christianity, and it all flows through from one to the other, and it's all based on this same error that goes all the way back to original Judaism that was Egyptian originally.
You hear that? The youngest of all the Nile Valley civilizations is really he really birthed all of the civilizations and their belief systems. The youngest. Yet that's all they talk about. Every fucking movie is about Egypt. Yet Egypt was birthed out of these older Asiatic civilizations.
Now, when you think of the Bible, you think of the Old Testament and a lot of these other ancient writings. They talk, very much about, and of course, the Bible references Adam and Eve, and that's where the story begins. And then you move into these characters like, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then it evolves from there. So when we talk about the Old Testament, and you're saying that it goes all the way back to Egypt, what would be the motivation behind bringing forward an incorrect or even just a fractured history, or only maybe bringing in certain parts and possibly misguiding people with this? And what would you feel would be the strongest motivation behind doing something like that?
Interesting question. That is open to debate, but my idea behind this is that these people were actually kicked out of Egypt. So the Hyksos were kicked out of Egypt on a great exodus, which is a historical reality. We know
historical
all about
realities, it's true.
It just so happens that exodus is exactly the same as the biblical exodus. It has the darkness, it has the rain and the battle with the Egyptians, and they start from Pyramisi and they go to Jerusalem and all of this sort of business. It's exactly the same. So these people were actually kicked out of Egypt, and I think that altered. That had a big bearing on how this religion developed in later generations, in later centuries. In fact, they were kicked out of Egypt twice, because if you read Manetho is the Egyptian historian from about the 3rd century BC.
You hear this shit?
And he writes a secular version of
Manetho, as we've heard from many scholars, is full of shit. He went he over-exaggerated everything just to demonize our ancestors. When we came in there, we helped Egypt. All these movies we fucking see, all these things we hear about Egypt. Tell me, haven't your whole life you've known about the Egyptian chariot? Huh? Your whole life. It's all you've ever seen was an Egyptian chariot. You find out the Egyptians never even had those chariots until you came to Egypt. They had wagons, 4-wheeled wagons. You've never seen a movie with an Egyptian 4-wheeled wagon, because they don't show you that shit. They show you a Hebrew 2-wheeled war chariot, and they sell it to you as an Egyptian war chariot. Come on, people. Your whole life is being stolen right in front of your eyes. And you're like, please, sir, more Grey Poupon. Please, sir, more Kool-Aid. Could I get more Kool-Aid, sir?
This history. And he says there were 2 exoduses.
Oh, 2 exoduses.
So we have the first Exodus, which was the big Hyksos Exodus that we know all about. And the second Exodus is fairly obvious, and in later sort of conversations we can go through the detail on this, but it's fairly obvious that the second Exodus was the Exodus of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And of course Pharaoh Akhenaten was the first monotheist. This is where the monotheism comes from. If you read Moses and Monotheism by Freud, where he links Pharaoh Akhenaten with Judaism, that's perfectly correct, because that's where it came from. This was the second Exodus. So we have these people that were exiled from their former homeland. I mean, they were obviously very powerful. Egypt was the superpower of that age. They're then exiled.
And you know why he's able to say this bullshit? Because everything before Amenat was destroyed. They destroyed all the evidence from Joseph, all the evidence of us coming there. Practically everything. And they had to reinvent it. And that's why he can say that shit, because the reinvention says nothing of it. Because they don't care about you. You write about the man. If you had to write a story about your life, would you make sure you have the people you despise the most in the books? Talking about them? Showing their history, their life? No. And that's what they did to us. Asiatics. Afro, full-bearded, Asiatic, copper-colored. Read it and weep, bro.
Into less wealthy regions. They were then exiled yet again because of the Babylonian exile, where the Babylonians captured Jerusalem.
You hear this shit? No, he's just saying, it's true. They were kings in Egypt. Yeah, no, it's true. They did leave Egypt under the same pretense as the Torah. Oh yes, they did go and get exiled into Babylon. All this Torah, Old Testament, yes, it's all verifiable. Yet when we go into our communities with our people who are those people in the Bible, and you start saying this shit, say, man, that shit is allegory. Man, that shit is fake, man. That's fairy tales, man. That's the myth, fool. Gematria.
And I think once they were on that exile, if you read the
Gematria, yet our language is a number-based language. And certain numbers are prime numbers that have meanings beyond what you understand. And these Masonic institutions understand it. So just because numbers line up doesn't mean that it's fake. These people are just copying a foundation that the ancestors used, and they perverting it to its fullest extent.
accounts in the Tanakh, it does appear that Egypt became the pariah state. So Egypt became the font of all of the evils that had befallen these people, why they were exiled to Babylon and all of this sort of business. And so if Egypt is the evil place that caused all of these terrible things to happen, well, can you admit to being Egyptian? And likewise, if all of these terrible things...
If I came in, if my grandfather came in with a standing army, and then I came back 200 years later and came there and built up your kingdom once again, ruled in your kingdom, and then got kicked out of your kingdom, am I an Egyptian? I don't understand this. This is the thinking of the Europeans. They come in from wherever they come from, Africa or the outer lands, and then they come into Europe and they come into America and they say, well, we're Europeans and we're Americans. That's not how it works. What nation you are, that's where you come from. That's your nation. If you come to Hawaii, you're not an Hawaiian. You don't become an Hawaiian because you're born in Hawaii. You become a Hawaiian if you come from the ancient peoples of these lands. You understand?
Things befell your people, can you admit to you were actually the most powerful people in the whole of the world as pharaohs of Egypt, and you actually got kicked out of the country. Perhaps it's easier to sell a sob story about your being persecuted underlings, and it was the evil Egyptians that kicked you out of the country, and you know, you were just trying to be peaceful shepherds, and all these evil Egyptians kicked you out. I think this is where it's much easier to sell this sob story about the persecution than admit that you were a very powerful nation who actually lost this civil war against the Egyptians. A powerful nation who actually lost this civil war against the Egyptians. And what happened was...
So you're a powerful nation, he said.
The story didn't change at all. So they didn't change the story. They just changed the context, basically. So, yeah, they were shepherds. They were shepherd kings. And so they just said, oh,
Kings.
well, we were just shepherds. Same title, same history, same events, but now you're just saying you're poor shepherds instead of shepherd kings. But we know that's wrong, because if you read Josephus, and for listeners here who haven't read Josephus, he wrote a complete secular version of the Old Testament. And significantly, his Old Testament came from the scroll that was captured after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, when the Romans captured Jerusalem. So his scroll, his Torah, is actually older than any extant Torah today. So the version given by Josephus is probably more original than...
You hear that? The guy who was working with the Roman armies, a general, who captured Jerusalem and Alexandria, has the most authentic and oldest Torah ever. And that's right, though. Right, your oppressors, they conquer you. They take your books. They keep the best of the books, rewrite the books to make it fit their agenda. And they hold those greatest books for their people to read. While you reading this perverted shit.
Than any Old Testament we have today. And we have some significant differences. So if you read the Torah, it will say that Abraham had 318 servants, which is a bit strange for a shepherd. You know, how many shepherds with a few starving sheep have 318 servants? But this is clarified by Josephus, because if you go into Josephus, he says that Abraham actually had 318 army officers and an army of unlimited manpower. Now, if they were centurions, we're talking about a standing army of over 30,000 soldiers. Shepherds don't have an army of that nature. The only shepherds that would have an army of that size in this era would be the shepherd kings, the Hyksos shepherd kings of Egypt. And so Josephus is plainly stating that Abraham was not a poor shepherd with a few starving sheep on top of a hill, which is the imagery they like to give us within the priesthood. Josephus is clearly stating that Abraham was a king with the largest standing army in the whole of that region in that era. He was a shepherd king. And so the story hasn't changed.
And that's what I want you guys to hear.
With the largest standing army in the whole of that region in that era.
The largest.
He was a shepherd king.
He was a shepherd king.
And so the story hasn't changed. He was a king with the largest standing army in the whole of that region in that era.
So you weren't no begging little fool dying out there suffering. You were a great kingdom with a great army and a great people with knowledge, sophistication, and like you've always had. You've always had this. Study your cultures and learn that you've always been sophisticated. You've always been like this. Research my Hawaiian. We wrote symphonies. We wrote there's so much history to show that the truth about our beginnings, our origins, and on our ancestors. We don't want to hear it.
He was a shepherd king. And so the story hasn't changed, and that's good in some respects, because the story hasn't changed, we can go back through the story and actually pick out the original historical details. Because the story hasn't changed. All they've done is change the context. The shepherd king has become the shepherd. And they don't admit why they were called shepherds in the first place. This is all astrological.
You see them
So they've lost the astrology.
You see it? Straight back to their ancient
to
beliefs.
Judaism.
Condiments.
And we know that astrology was central to Judaism, because if you go to the Sea of Galilee, if you go to Tiberias, just 4 kilometers, no, probably less than that, 2 kilometers
and I'm not
outside.
stating that astrology is a Canaanite belief, and that we never use this for our dating and stuff, and farming, all of these different things, surfing, I mean, all of these different things. But what I'm trying to say is that they're going to bring up a fallen angel now. They always do this shit. No, it's really about this and this fallen angel, and that they took this shit from this, and it's really this. And it's all bullshit. Cloud your judgment.
Tiberias, there is a synagogue. 1st century. In my view, it's 1st century. They say it's 3rd century, but I can prove it's 1st century. And lo and behold, the biggest thing in the center of this synagogue is a zodiac. And this is not unusual, because they've done a lot of archaeology in the region, and they have found 6 synagogues in this region across Israel and Jordan. And they all have zodiacs on the floor. And these are synagogues. They are pure Judaic synagogues with zodiacs. So we know that the zodiac was central to original Judean worship. I say Judean, this is more like Nazarene Judaism. Nazarene being the sect led by Jesus, of course.
Look, Jesus, of course. Jesus, of course. Aries, of course. Yeah, 2 fallen angels already.
And this is where the imagery of the shepherds come from, of course, because the shepherd was Aries. Would your listeners be familiar with procession, the procession of the equinox?
You see this? Now they're gonna say they was all fucking heathens, because look, they used the equinox. They used the summer solstice, they used all of these things. And why not? Huh? You think those things exist and we didn't understand them? It's just that we didn't pervert them. When we created yoga, we didn't make 666 hand symbols and all this bullshit hand symbols, the vagina symbols they tell you to make. And now today nobody wants to do yoga. Yoga is some bullshit. Yeah, you think our ancestors didn't do yoga, fool? Oh yeah, you think you're nimble now? You think you're a badass now? Imagine if you did yoga. Imagine how nimble you would be then. Man, we invented martial arts and all this stuff. Yoga is an attachment, is a part of it, because it's all it is breathing exercises and stretching. Ain't no fucking crazy. It ain't no like witchcraft or anything. As long as you don't make symbols and signs with your hands, you don't need those hand symbols to create an electric flow through your body. Actually, many of those hand symbols prevent the correct flow from happening, from closing up your hands, from redirecting your power. You're doing all this stuff, and it's not it's not always beneficial for you. And then you say the practice is bogus, but it's not the practice, it's the how you were taught to practice these arts, which they just stole from us.
Maybe we could review it for some people that might not be.
Let's have a quick overview then. This was the
I'm
central
about to
element
dismount, so a
in
couple
all
minutes
of these
I'm out of
ancient
here.
religions was the procession of the equinox, and we can talk about why it was so central.
We'll try and
later.
get some Bible
But
reading.
it so happens that the Earth wobbles on its axis.
Wobbles.
And as it does wobble, it points at different stars in different eras.
Wobbles.
And so it runs through all 12 constellations in about 26,000 years. So each constellation changes when you view it at the spring equinox, at the dawn sunrise at the spring equinox. Each constellation changes every 2,140 years, roughly. And so you can track the millennia by this, by watching the constellations pass by over the centuries, over the millennia. And it's very predictable, so we know when all of these changes happened. And the change from Taurus to Aries happened in about 1750 odd BC. And this was the whole contention between the bull worshippers and the shepherds that we read about in the Torah. It was all about astrology, which is interesting because, and again, we can go back through this later and talk about it in more detail, but it means that some of the quotes we get within the Torah are verbatim quotes from 3,500 years ago. We have verbatim quotes of conversations between Pharaoh and the Israelites, and we know they are verbatim because they make absolute perfect sense if you understand what they're talking about. And as you run through,
sorry to interrupt you, Ralph. Just while we're on that subject, I wondered if you would be able to speak just quickly on some of the ancient art as well. When we're talking about, the moving from Taurus into Aries, and then of course you see paintings of, Moses and Abraham and whatnot that have horns, almost as if they're symbolizing that they are the the priests or the representation of this movement. Do you think that there's anything to the fact that these characters, may not have actually even existed? They may have been symbolic metaphor, or do you think that there's also a historical context as well?
No, very much. I believe in a historical Torah. Again, I'm not religious. I'm looking at this as a historian, and historians have thrown the Torah out with the bathwater because they won't look at it because it's religious. And I keep saying to them, if you found an ancient text from 1500 BC sitting in a pot in Egypt, and you dug this thing up and this big scroll came out, would you just throw it away because it mentions gods? No, they would be looking at each sentence, each verse in this great scroll to see what history they can find. And that's what we've got in the Torah. So I do believe in a historical Torah, that it's a real document, and I can pretty much prove that it is a real document because of these verbatim statements that come out of history. And this agreement between the Torah text and the astrology that we've just been talking about, the precession of the equinox. So these people were real characters. So Moses was the brother of Akhenaten, who happened to be called Moses. So the brother of Akhenaten, again, I'm not religious. I'm looking at this as a historian, and historians have thrown the Torah out with the bathwater because they won't look at it because it's religious. And I keep saying to them, if you found an ancient text from 1500 BC sitting in a pot in Egypt, and you dug this thing up and this big scroll came out, would you just throw it away because it mentions gods? No, they would be looking at each sentence, each verse in this great scroll to see what history they can find. And that's what we've got in the Torah. So I do believe in a historical Torah, that it's a real document, and I can pretty much prove that it is a real document because of these verbatim statements that come out of history. And this agreement between the Torah text and the astrology that we've just been talking about, the precession of the equinox. So these people were real characters.
And I'm out.